Hi guys, so I'm going to be spending the next 15 minutes talking to you about the relationship that young queer students have with science. In this case, queer means basically anyone who identifies as being anything other than heterosexual or cisgender. First up, I need to do a quick bit of housekeeping. Just so you're all aware, I myself identify as queer. This will become apparent why it's important later on. Also, I need to give a quick content warning. There will be discussions about homophobia and transphobia throughout, so please be aware of that. But I will get started. So I'm going to make a quick assumption, just to start off, that most people here at one time or another have felt out of place. I think most people have. I mean, I certainly have. And it really sucks because you're somewhere and you really enjoy being there, but you just feel like you're not fitting in or like you don't belong. And it's usually got something to do with how we perceive those places or how we perceive ourselves. And for many people, that place is science. So science communication is aware that there's a real diversity issue going on. They've previously looked at women's experiences in science and people of color's experiences of science and the experiences of people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. However, there's one group that really hasn't been looked at, and it is queer people. So this is an area of research that's really only just beginning to take off, and there has been a public call for this research. So that's where really my research is coming from, this public outcry for a look at queer experiences within science. And there's been a real lack of research, obviously, in this area. But there is a few things that we know usually from areas outside of science communication. So first up, there's the historical relationship that queer people have with science. And I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It hasn't been great. There's this real feeling that science has really been weaponized against queer people, using it to justify bigotry and hate towards them. And the biggest way this has been seen is in the way that science has been used to try and fix queer people and queer identity. From this then comes the idea that queer people are a group that needs to be studied rather than a group that does study. And this takes away a lot of agency from queer people, and it sort of takes their voices away from them by straight cisgendered people. So they end up being spoken for in ways that they may not appreciate and really have their voice taken away from them, and they're no longer in control of their own narrative. We also need to acknowledge that science really enjoys classifying things and people and groups. And there's this idea that unless you're given a good classification, it automatically means you're given a bad classification. There is no real neutral. And very early on, queer people, queer identity wasn't given a good classification by science. But it's not just about history. There has been some more recent research looking at the experience of queer people in STEM workplaces. So this sort of tends to look at job satisfaction of queer people. And unsurprisingly, queer people report having lower job satisfaction than their non-queer counterparts. This tends to also be related to how open these queer people are at work. There's reported lower openness about queer identity in STEM workplaces. And this just sort of ends up hiding queer identity within science. So this silencing sort of really begins quite early on, from the moment we start learning about science in schools. They tend to ignore queer existence, and they use a very heteronormative way of looking at the world when explaining science to people in school. And it's a lot of the language that is being used tends to feel very hostile towards queer people. And it really cements into younger people's minds that queer doesn't have a place in science. But at this point, there's not a whole lot of research that really backs up a lot of this, especially in science communication. So that's where I was at the start of my research, understanding that kind of stuff. And it led to one overarching aim, which was to understand how young queer people's relationship with science impacts their engagement with science, and how their queer identity then impacts that relationship. So I ended up conducting a series of semi-structured interviews, asking people who self-identified as queer about their experiences with science and how that sort of intersected with their queer identity. And this included asking about discussions of queer issues within science, and whether they could name any science communicators who they identified as being queer, and whether they'd ever been made to feel uncomfortable in science spaces due to their queerness. And these interviews tended to last 15 to 35 minutes. There were criteria for participants. They all had to come from the University of Western Australia. They had to currently be enrolled in an undergraduate degree. They all had to be over 18, and obviously they had to identify as being queer. And this was taken care of in a pre-screening survey before they were later contacted about interviews, being invited to be interviewed. So in the end, we were aiming to interview 20 to 30 people because we figured that would be about where we would start to see themes emerging. And in the end, I interviewed 23 people aged 18 to 23. Of those, 11 were studying science, 10 were studying arts, and 2 were majoring in both an arts and a science subject. So then I took all of the audio recordings and I transcribed them. And then like Tam, I inductively coded, which basically means that I came up with the codes as I went along rather than using a pre-established code book, because we didn't really know what we were going to find. So we didn't want to miss anything. I then applied a sort of hierarchical framework in order to better understand the codes and to create my themes. So what I ended up finding was, when specifically asked, only one person could name a current queer science communicator, and that was ASAP Science. 3 others could name a historical queer person, which was Alan Turing. I'm going to guess that's because of the Imitation Game, which came out about 10 years ago. But that means the majority of the 23 people who were asked could not name a single queer science communicator or scientist. Then when discussing their experiences within science, there was this real idea that they couldn't be open with their queer identity within science. For instance, participant 17 said, "It's not a place that I feel like I could express my queerness." In contrast, in the arts, they felt that it was much more open, with participant 14 saying, "It's more of an open discussion in arts." Then I asked about their feelings about science and arts, and quite often it was brought up that the people I interviewed didn't feel like they really fit into science. Participant 2 actually said, "I don't feel like I really fit in." And a huge theme that really emerged was that they didn't see themselves represented in science, with participant 14 openly saying they didn't see themselves represented. This same sort of idea wasn't seen in arts, where they felt like they saw a lot more representation and they could be a lot more open about their queer identity. And then this led to this feeling of being uncomfortable in science, with participant 2, for instance, saying, "I tend to feel a little uncomfortable." And in some cases, they even expressed a feeling of unsafeness within science due to their queer identity. For instance, participant 23 said, "I would feel unsafe doing a science unit or course." Of course, this also then came with feeling just sort of unwelcome, with it being almost described as a gated community. But there was a really interesting difference in the way that participants viewed science and arts. They really saw science as being far more traditional and arts being a lot more progressive. But even within that, different scientific fields had different ideas of how progressive they were. For instance, the softer sciences tended to be seen as being a lot more diverse than the harder sciences. So participant 14 said studying physics felt a lot more rigid, but psychology was very much identified as being a lot more diverse. And then that was contrasted with arts, with one participant saying, "Arts, I feel, is I associate more with counterculture." There was obviously still a fear about weaponization that was brought up a lot, that participants were scared about what science could do to queer identity and queer people, with one even saying, "And in that way, it has that underlying tone of how could we fix it," which obviously is a historical worry that is present with queer people in science. Having said that, it's not all bad. There were a number of people who were studying science who expressed a lack of fear. They weren't worried about their future in science by being a queer person. There was this real idea that it was beginning to get a bit better for them. So, just as a refresher, my research aim was to understand how young queer people's relationship with science impacts their engagement with science, and how their queer identity then impacts that relationship. So essentially what was found was that queer identity was really hidden within science. And part of that was to do with the fact that there's this idea that in order to be unbiased within science, you have to separate the self from science. For a lot of queer people, this is really difficult to do. Participant 12 talked about it, saying, "I feel like people have unrealistic expectations that like queer people can just turn off their queerness and be like normal." Obviously, being queer is an inherent part of our identity, and it would be the same as asking someone to turn off their femaleness or their maleness. It's not something you can necessarily do because it's part of who we are. So what ends up happening is that queer people just try to hide it rather than turn it off. And this then signals to other people, other young queer people, that there aren't queer people in science because they're not seeing anyone, they're not seeing themselves represented. And it really turns queerness into something that is invisible within science, and it almost makes people feel like queer identity isn't important to science at all. So it also needs to be noted that there was a wish from these participants that there would be more queer representation in science. They really believed that if they'd seen more queer people growing up in science, that it would be easier for them now to be queer and in science. And of course, that's only speculation because they didn't have anyone to point to, but I tend to agree with them that representation would have made it easier for them as a young person interested in science. So without queer voices, science really tends to be done in ways that can be seen as really unfriendly to queer people. The language that's used can be quite uncomfortable. For instance, in biology, they still use the term hermaphrodite, which obviously for a lot of queer people is quite an uncomfortable term. And they have this real expectation that they are going to be facing homophobia and transphobia when they enter into science spaces. So they sort of begin to believe that there's a removed chance of them succeeding within science. And no one really wants to be in an area where they feel like they can't succeed. So they just tend to sort of stop engaging with science as much. And they really have no role models to point to say, that is what I want to look like in the future. Having said this, in arts, there wasn't the same sort of issue. This is perhaps why there's a feeling that arts is a lot more open and diverse. We can all name queer artists going back many, many years. And there's this idea that they have that representation in arts and they can look to people and they can point to them and say, that is what I want to be when I grow up. This is perhaps why there's this stereotype that queer people end up going into arts. There's a lot of queer representation and there's a bigger queer community, and queer people tend to feel more comfortable there. So they will see arts as being a lot more welcoming and more friendly towards them than they see science. They can put their trust into the arts because they know that they are going to be accepted there. But they're not expecting discrimination when they enter there. And if this stereotype is true, then there's already a lot of openly queer people there for them to look to. There's also the stereotypes of different fields within science, with people viewing certain areas of science as being a lot more unwelcoming. We already talked about it in the results section, but physics and engineering and chemistry and maths and those areas are really considered to be a lot less diverse than areas like psychology and biology. As participant 16 put it, fields that involve probably a bit more human study tend to have to be a little more aware of things. And in that case, it's this idea that in the softer sciences, they tend to have a lot more human interaction, especially when they're conducting research. Psychology tends to do a lot of research that involves human participants. And so they have to be very aware of their own biases and the way that language and the way they act really has an impact on the people that they're studying in a way that physics or chemistry doesn't really. I mean, it's been a while since I've done any physics or chemistry, but I'm sort of assuming that like homophobia doesn't influence atoms. So there's this idea that these harder sciences really haven't begun to unpack their biases within the culture and how that might impact how people view them or experience learning in those areas or entering into those areas of science. Whereas in like psychology and biology, they've had to consider those. So I don't think it's a surprise that we are still worried about weaponization. There is this real worry that science is going to be used against queer people. For instance, most recently, there's this idea of like looking for the gay gene. And that can be really damaging for queer people because they're unsure of how that science will then be applied to their lives and their lived experiences. And they really don't want to try and explain this sort of queer existence because it might be used in a way that's harmful towards them. So there is this idea of like fixing queer identity that still exists within queer communities and within queer people. And it's really treated, queer identity is really treated as something that needs to be explained by science, which a lot of queer people aren't okay with. There is also the fact that a lot of these young queer people are looking online on social media, and they're seeing science language and scientific studies being used to justify a lot of bigotry towards queer identity and why they shouldn't exist anymore. And this makes it really difficult for them to engage in those discussions or engage in science online, because they're seeing it being used against them, and it can be quite confronting and quite difficult to engage in those discussions. We even had one person who really picked up on the idea of a lack of agency, describing science as making them feel like a test subject. And that's obviously really damaging if they're trying to engage with science and they're just feeling like they're not a person when they enter into it. And part of this comes from the fact that they're not seeing any queer researchers researching queer issues. They're only seeing non-queer people do it. And that's why it's important at the start that I identified that I am queer, because I am a queer person identifying queer issues that matter to queer people. It creates a bit more trust in what I'm doing for those people that I'm interviewing. So basically what I'm saying is that there's no real queer science communicators, and queer people end up feeling very wary about science, and they find it unwelcoming to their identity. And they might be willing to deal with it because they love science, but it is something that they have to deal with. So really, the conclusion is that there's not enough representation for queer people within science, and they need more of it in order to begin to feel more welcomed and more comfortable within science spaces. But it's not all bad. Obviously, I was talking to young people who are currently studying science or not studying science, and the way they were viewing it was that it is getting better. And luckily, talking to these young people, I could see that this new generation of queer scientists are really fighting to make a better future in science for other queer people. They recognize there's an issue and they want to help be part of the solution. Participant 6 said it best: "I think the future looks bright." There obviously were some limitations to this study. Obviously, the participants were all young, which was what we were aiming for, but they all came from the same university and they all had the same level of education. Also inherent to this kind of research, they all had to be out of the closet. They all had to be open with their queer identity. And it can be quite hard to tell a stranger really personal things about your experience, especially when it comes around your gender identity or your sexuality. It also needs to be noted that the research was conducted in Australia, which is ultimately quite an accepting country for queer identity. And so if this was conducted in another country, might have had different results. So in short, although there are queer people willing to be in science, queer issues and queer identity are still being systematically hidden within science, which makes it feel very unwelcoming for queer people. But it is getting better. I have hope. I hope you guys do too. Thank you.
Awesome. Can we give Claire a massive Zoom round of applause? That was really, really interesting. Really interesting. Thank you very much for sharing that. Yeah, I do have a few questions. If you have anything that you want to put down in the chat for me to ask as well, I'd be keen to hear your thoughts and to ask some things. Yeah. Do you think, I think my main question, my main takeaway from your talk, do you think maybe this is a call for those of us, and I'm including myself in this as well, those of us who are queer in science communication, to be a little bit more visible and a little bit more open about it? Because it is a very personal thing, and this might be a generational thing as well between millennials and Gen Z. I have noticed a little bit of that as well. And I was just wondering about your thoughts about whether or not it's something that needs to be looked at, I guess.
Yeah, no, I think it definitely does need to be looked at, but I think obviously the conclusion that I drew was that we need more representation. So we do need people who are more people who are willing to be open about their own queer identity, especially within science and science communication. But that comes with needing to feel like it's safe for them to be open about it. And I think that's an issue that needs to probably be addressed first, rather than just telling people to be out in public.
Yeah, definitely. Joanna's got a question here. So where would students be expecting or wanting to find their queer role models? So were the students attending kind of science events, or more seeing the lecturers and having them say, you know, that they're queer? Or is it kind of more who's in front of them on TikTok and that kind of thing?
Yeah, so I think students would appreciate it if they saw it more in the classroom, especially if we're going back to high school. They're more likely going to have their first interactions with people who are interested in science in a classroom. So if teachers are willing to be perhaps a bit more open about that. But yeah, on social media is definitely a big one. In fact, there's research suggesting that queer science communicators are more likely to use the internet than the more traditional print.
Interesting.
Yeah, so having them online and just having them pushed, I guess, a bit more by the algorithms of all the various things, which I know can be difficult because they tend to suppress certain things. Yeah.
Yeah, they can. Hey. Yeah, so yeah, that's really interesting. Tom is wondering about your view on programs like Queers in Science. Are they useful? That kind of thing.
Yeah, so I think they have their use, obviously, because they're trying to bring representation forward and trying to be that voice to show that there are queers in science. However, I think they weren't mentioned by any of my participants at all. So clearly they're missing a demographic in their approach. So that may be something that they want to look at going forward, but they definitely have a place. It's just, I think maybe they're not being utilized best for the younger generation.
Did you find any, this is from Sophie, did you find any resources that could be utilized in the workplace to normalize queer openness in the workplace, or maybe some clubs or communities specifically for queer people in science?
Yeah, so I didn't end up looking for that. I was more looking for sort of where science has gone wrong rather than looking for solutions at this point, because this is really just foundational research. I'm sure they're out there if I did want to go looking for them, because obviously it's important, and workplaces are trying to have a push for it, certainly these days. But it didn't come under the research I was conducting this time.
Heather just said, I spoke to the WA chapter at Pride Fair Day. Amazing. There was a question I was going to ask. Back to kind of, I think you were talking about coming into contact with queer people in science in high school. You mentioned as well things like kind of weaponized language. Do you think it's important maybe for us to be addressing that in the way that we approach the science? We just need to talk about it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think there was a question in there somewhere.
Yeah, essentially we do need to be talking about it. I mean, I did ask my participants whether they'd heard about any queer issues being talked about in science, or like that kind of stuff being discussed. And most of them said no. And when they did, it was like really technical language about trans identity and stuff like that, which obviously doesn't relate much to actual experiences of being trans, because they're not thinking in technical terms. So the language that we are using, certainly at the moment, is, yeah, it's really unfriendly, and it can be quite hostile towards the people who identify with these identities.
Yeah, definitely. Does anybody else have any other questions? Chuck them down in the chat for me. But yeah, this is a really, really interesting area of research. Yeah, and I appreciate you doing it. I think it's really cool. Yeah. No more questions? Fantastic. Oh, hang on. Tom wants to know, I'm interested in how does someone who is queer, who isn't stereotypically queer, be out as a role model?
Yeah, it's a great question, because if there's no physical signifiers, it can be difficult to say. If it's on social media, you can put it into your bios and your profiles. Certainly on TikTok, there's a way of doing it, and like a tagging system. It's just about openly talking about it and being willing to say it, rather than just hoping people pick up on it, essentially. Yeah,
it's interesting. I can kind of think off the top of my head of a a few open science communicators who are queer. It's interesting that the people that you interviewed in, you know, in that demographic aren't picking up on them as well. So yeah, I think there's a lot of questions in there about how we are communicating that information, you know? Yeah, it's very interesting. Yeah, amazing. All right, I think, oh, hang on, no, we do have one more. Is there room for future research? Can we expand that pool?
Yeah, definitely. I'm hoping to be researching more of this, and I won't just be looking at like young queer students at UWA. I'll be looking at other groups and sort of just expanding a lot more on what I've already done. But that's obviously to come in the future.
Great. We'll keep an eye out for it.